How could an illiterate swineherd, supposedly abandoned on a church's steps as an infant, manage to destroy the most powerful empire in the New World? He commanded fewer than 200 men against an army of tens of thousands. This is not a story of brilliant strategy or divine providence. It is a tale of a man whose primary weapons were desperation and a complete absence of moral restraint. His name was Francisco Pizarro. He was born a bastard in a destitute Spanish province, the illegitimate son of a colonel who never acknowledged him. His childhood was not filled with chivalric romances, but with the squalor of a pigsty and constant hunger. In 15th century Spain, there were only 3 paths for someone like him: the army, the gallows, or death in a ditch. But then a 4th, incredible option emerged: the New World. For noble hidalgos, it was a chance for glory. For the crown, new territories. For Pizarro, it was his only lottery ticket. He didn't cross the ocean for adventure. He fled humiliating poverty. He understood a simple, primal truth. Gold was not just wealth. It was power, capable of rewriting his biography, making the world forget who he was, and respecting him for who he became. By the time he heard legends of the golden Inca Empire, Pizarro was already an aging, worn-out man. He had spent nearly 30 years in the most brutal corners of the Caribbean and Panama. This was his university. Here he learned to trust no one, to betray before being betrayed, and to view human life as mere expendable currency. He had witnessed how Hernán Cortés, a fellow adventurer, brought the Aztec Empire to its knees. Pizarro understood. History is written not by the noble, but by the audacious. His first 2 expeditions to the south failed spectacularly. He lost men, plunged into immense debt, and became a laughingstock. Anyone else in his position would have given up. But for a man who had nothing to lose from birth, failure was just another step. He stood on the shore of the Pacific Ocean, old, despised, yet obsessed. He looked south not as an explorer, but as a gambler staking his life on one final, decisive hand. And he was ready to do anything to break the bank. This world was not made for him, and he realized it early. He saw his father, Colonel Gonzalo Pizarro, on the streets of his hometown, Trujillo. The noble hidalgo, a war hero, would ride past on horseback, oblivious to the boy in the dirt who carried his blood. This was the first and greatest injustice. You are nothing. Your existence is a mistake, one easier to ignore. This invisibility burned more fiercely than any hunger. His only family was a herd of pigs. He didn't just herd them, he lived among them. He smelled like them. To the entire town, he was one of them. A dirty, illiterate creature whose life wasn't worth a single maravedí. It was there, in the dirt, in daily humiliation, that a predator, not a soldier, was forged. He viewed the world from the bottom up and saw straight through it. He saw pious lords speak of honor while cheating the poor. He heard priests preach humility while living in luxury. He understood. All these beautiful words, honor, faith, law, were merely tools the powerful used to keep the weak on their knees. And in that moment he made a decision. If the world offered no rules by which he could win, then he would play without rules at all. He didn't aim to prove he was better than others. He intended to make them fear him. He didn't want respect. He wanted power, absolute, animalistic power that would erase his past. He needed more than just gold. He needed so much might that the King of Spain himself would be forced to regard him not as a swineherd, but as an equal. This wasn't greed. It was vengeance against a world that had once pretended he didn't exist. Spain itself was on the brink at that time. 700 years of the Reconquista, a continuous war for its own land against the Moors, had just concluded. Victory brought unity, but spawned a new, far more dangerous problem. The country was overflowing with men who knew only one thing: how to fight. Thousands of hidalgos, soldiers, and mercenaries whose entire lives had been a battle suddenly found themselves without purpose. Yesterday's heroes, today unable to feed their families. Peace had arrived and they had become redundant. This was an army of unemployed predators, and it urgently needed a new victim. Then Columbus discovered America. This was not just a new route to India, it was an escape valve through which Spain could release all its simmering energy, all its accumulated cruelty and poverty. The New World became a national obsession. Gold transformed into a religion. Everyone needed it. The crown, to pay for its endless European wars, the nobility, to maintain their status, and thousands of poor people like Pizarro simply to stop being nobodies. This was not colonization as we understand it. It was the largest state-sanctioned and church-blessed heist in human history. And across the ocean lay a continent where there was no king, no court, no god in the familiar sense. There, only one law prevailed, the law of force. Royal decrees drowned in the Atlantic. Church sermons didn't penetrate the jungles. It was a gigantic gray area where one could become fabulously rich or die of an unnamed fever. And no one in Madrid would bother to investigate how exactly you acquired your gold, by sword or by deception. The main thing was to bring the crown its share, the famous quinto, or fifth part. Pizarro was not a unique monster. He was the perfect product of his time, a generation born of war, raised in poverty, and blinded by the gleam of distant gold. The Inca Empire was not doomed on the day he set foot on its shore. It was doomed the moment the last Moorish flag fell in Granada, leaving Spain with an army of hungry conquerors and an insatiable thirst for new worlds. His men were dying of hunger on a lost island when ships from Panama finally arrived for them. The governor's order was simple: immediately cease the suicidal venture and return. For everyone else, it was salvation. For Pizarro, it was the end of a dream. And then he did something that would forever become legend. He drew his sword and traced a line in the sand. Then he turned to his emaciated soldiers and declared, "To the north lies Panama and poverty. To the south, Peru and its treasures. Let each of you choose what befits a brave Castilian." He stepped across the line. Only 13 men followed him. The rest sailed home. This scene is not about bravery. It is about one man's fanatical belief in his destiny, a belief capable of compelling others to step into the abyss. 5 years later, this madman stood at the gates of Cajamarca, a city in the heart of the Inca Empire. He had 168 soldiers. Against him stood the 80,000-strong army of the supreme Inca, Atahualpa, who had just won a civil war. Any commander in history, faced with such odds, would have ordered a retreat. Pizarro, however, conceived something beyond military art. He devised the greatest robbery in history. He invited the living god, the ruler of the empire, to peaceful negotiations in the city square. Atahualpa, confident in his power and contemptuous of a handful of dirty foreigners, agreed. He arrived on a golden palanquin, surrounded by thousands of unarmed courtiers. He expected to see envoys. He saw an empty square. And then a cannon shot rang out. It was the signal. Spanish armored horsemen burst from the buildings, shouting, "Santiago!" The massacre began. The Incas, who had never seen horses or heard the thunder of gunfire, were paralyzed by terror. They were slaughtered by the hundreds. Pizarro's target, however, was just one man. He personally fought his way through the crowd and seized Atahualpa, dragging him from the palanquin. In a single evening, he achieved the impossible. He kidnapped a god, and with him an entire empire. Pizarro had no charisma, none at all. He was neither a brilliant orator nor the life of the party. Illiterate, crude, with the heavy gaze of a man who spent his life expecting a stab in the back. He couldn't inspire people with lofty ideals, but he possessed a far rarer and more dangerous talent. He unerringly saw the cracks in the human soul. He was a brilliant diagnostician of others' greed, fear, and despair. He didn't sell his men a dream of a great Spain or serving God. He offered them a business plan. He spoke the only language they understood: profit. He didn't promise them eternal glory. He promised them a share. To each and every one, he transformed the expedition into a joint stock company where every soldier was an investor, having staked his own life. And he masterfully fanned the frenzy. Every speck of gold found in previous failed expeditions, every rumor of golden cities, became part of his advertising campaign. His famous 13 followers on Gallo Island were not merely brave men. They were individuals pushed to the absolute limit, as bankrupt and outcast as he was. Pizarro didn't seek the best soldiers. He sought the hungriest. He looked into their eyes and saw not valor, but an emptiness that could only be filled with gold. He was a genius casting director of despair. He assembled not an army, but a gang, where everyone understood there was no turning back, because behind them awaited nothing but debtor's prison or the gallows. And to convince investors and the king, he brought proof to Spain, not maps or stories. He brought 2 captured Indians whom he forced to learn Spanish. He brought several llamas and gold ornaments. These were living trailers for his future blockbuster. He presented these Indians before the royal court, and they spoke of a land where gold lay on the ground. It had a hypnotic effect. Pizarro wasn't just asking for money for an expedition. He was offering a ready-made investment project with guaranteed super profits. He didn't lead them, he made them accomplices. And from that moment on, their fates were inextricably linked with his, like convicts chained together. But this gang of convicts was merely the tip of the iceberg, the visible part of a far more serious operation. Behind Pizarro stood his partners, who had created a true shadow company for conquest. The first was Diego de Almagro, an equally illegitimate and illiterate soldier, but unlike the reclusive Pizarro, he was the soul of the army, responsible for recruitment and supplies. The second was Father Hernando de Luque, a quiet man with the eyes of a moneylender who officially invested the church's money. But in reality, Luque was merely a front. The real money came from the most influential man in Panama, Judge Gaspar de Espinosa, who wanted his share without risking his reputation. It was an ideal syndicate: Pizarro, the brain, Almagro, the brawn, and Espinosa, the purse, hidden behind the priest's cassock. And this syndicate had a powerful enemy. The governor of Panama, Pedro de los Rios, hated Pizarro. Not because of his cruelty, he was no better himself. He saw Pizarro not just as a madman, but as a dangerous competitor who was operating outside his authority. It was de los Rios who tried to stop the expedition, sending ships to retrieve Pizarro's ruffians from the cursed island. He saw this venture as a threat to his own business of plundering the New World. It was a war between 2 predators for the same prey. Pizarro realized, to win, he needed to bypass the governor. He pulled off a brilliant political maneuver. Taking llamas, Indians, and some gold with him, he traveled not to the governor, but directly to Spain, to King Charles V. There, at court, he staged his main spectacle. He spoke not of blood and failures, but of untold riches and millions of heathens awaiting God's word. And the king believed him. In 1529, Pizarro received what no governor could give him, a royal license for conquest, the Capitulations of Toledo. But this document contained a devilish detail. Pizarro claimed everything for himself: the title of governor, the best lands, the right to appoint officials. For his partner Almagro, who had risked his life alongside him, he secured only the position of commandant of a small fortress. He deceived everyone. Before conquering a single city, he had already betrayed his main ally. This robbery didn't begin with the Incas, it began with the deception of those who stood with him. And this crack in their alliance would later widen into a bloody chasm that would consume them all. The Inca gold was divided, the cities lay in ruins, the game seemed over, the bank broken. But for predators, the hunt never ends. Now they began to hunt each other. The stumbling block was Cusco, the ancient Inca capital, the main prize. Both partners, Pizarro and Almagro, wanted it. The royal decree was written so vaguely that it could be interpreted however one wished, and Pizarro, using his gubernatorial powers, claimed the city for himself. He sent his old comrade Almagro to conquer the southern lands, to Chile. It was an exile disguised as an expedition, a way to get rid of a competitor. Almagro returned 2 years later, without gold, angry, with the remnants of an exhausted army. He saw that Pizarro's family controlled everything, and nothing was left for him and his men. And then the unthinkable happened. Conquistadors began to wage war against conquistadors. Spaniards killed Spaniards on the land they had conquered together. Almagro lost. He was taken prisoner, and Pizarro's brother Hernando made a fatal mistake. He executed him. Not in battle, but by court sentence, as a criminal. The old sick soldier was garroted in the city square. Pizarro became the absolute ruler of Peru. He founded a new city, Lima, and ruled from his palace. He thought he had won. He failed to understand the main thing. By killing Almagro, he had transformed a rivalry over money into a blood feud. The executed man's supporters, the men of Chile, lived in Lima in complete destitution, gathered around Almagro's son. They were a walking reminder of his betrayal. Pizarro despised them and ignored all warnings. On June 26, 1541, 24 of these desperate men stormed the palace during dinner, shouting, "Death to the tyrant!" The 70-year-old Pizarro fought like a beast, but the odds were stacked against him. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The man who had deceived a king and destroyed an empire was cut down on the floor of his own home by a handful of vagrants. His last enemies were not the Incas or the jungle. He was killed by his own past, which he had so desperately tried to erase. But his death was not the end of the bloodshed. It was its new beginning. Peru plunged into chaos. The crown in Madrid finally realized what a monster it had spawned on the other side of the world. In 1542, the new laws were issued, intended to stop the slaughter. They forbade the enslavement of indigenous people and confiscated lands from the cruelest conquistadors. For Pizarro's gang, this was betrayal. Yesterday's heroes who had conquered an empire for the king were transformed into criminals with a stroke of a pen, and they rebelled. Francisco's brother, Gonzalo Pizarro, led a revolt against the crown, executing Peru's first viceroy. For almost 10 years, the country was engulfed in a new civil war, this time between the conquerors and royal authority. Almost all of the 13 who had once stepped across the line on Gallo Island perished. Not from Inca arrows, but from Spanish steel, in battles against each other or on the gallows. Their joint stock company went bankrupt, and the dividends were paid in blood. And what of the treasures? That legendary ransom for Atahualpa, a room full of gold and 2 of silver? It wasn't shipped out. It was melted down right there. Thousands of unique works of art, the entire cultural memory of an empire, were thrown into furnaces and transformed into faceless ingots and coins for shipment to Europe. But this flood of precious metals did not make Spain rich. It destroyed it. Money poured into the country, producing nothing. Prices skyrocketed tenfold. It became more profitable to buy goods abroad than to produce them at home. The Spanish economy died. Inca gold became a poison that slowly killed the empire from within, funding endless European wars and fostering total corruption. Ultimately, there were no winners in this story. The conquistadors annihilated each other. The Incas lost everything, and the gold they so desperately chased became a curse that undermined Spain itself. The greatest robbery in history ended in bankruptcy for all its participants. And what grew from these bones and cursed gold? Not a new Spain, not a righteous kingdom, but a myth. The legend of a man who achieved everything. He founded Lima, the city of kings, and built palaces, attempting to forge a new, noble biography for himself. He wanted to be remembered as a marquis, a governor, an explorer. He almost believed it. But history has a cruel sense of humor. For how do we remember him? Not as the governor of Peru, not as a city founder. Every story about him, every book, every film begins with the same phrase, the illiterate swineherd. That very stigma he fled across the ocean, that humiliation he tried to drown in the blood of an entire civilization, became his primary epithet. He became eternally fused with his past. This is the central, monstrous paradox of his life. He conquered an empire so the world would forget who he was, and the world remembered him precisely for that. His incredible ascent made his humiliating origins immortal. He did not erase his history. He carved it into the granite of eternity. He didn't want to be a nobody, and became one of the most famous nobodies in human history. Francisco Pizarro's story is not about how a man from the gutter can rise to princely status. It is an eternal reminder that you can never truly escape the dirt. You can build an empire on the other side of the world, you can drown a continent in blood, but the shadow of the boy who smelled of pigs will always follow you. And it is this shadow, not the gleam of a crown, that future generations will see.